Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this tutorial for Quilter's Creative Touch 5. So we have just had this update and a lot of quilters are needing help and are specifically wanting PDFs, some files to print out and be able to work through tutorials with them step by step. So my friend Janet George has been hard at work creating this awesome tutorial to help you quilt blocks using Quilter's Creative Touch 5. So come and check this out. She has given me permission to share these with you. You can find them at leahday.com/QCT help. So come and check these out. You can print them, download them. They're free for you to use. And in this tutorial, we are going to walk through the Blocks Power Placement program. So we're going to go step by step through this particular tutorial so you can print out the paper and work through it along with me. So let's get started learning how to place blocks with QCT5. So let's get started by double tapping our Quilter's Creative Touch 5. It's going to pop open this box and then it's going to say, make sure the sewing machine needle is up and move the carriage to the center of the sewing area. And it does this because once you click this button, the machine is going to move. You don't want the needle in the down position, so that way it can move slightly to the diagonal and then slightly back. So after a little bit of startup, this is our screen. As you can see, I am working with Quilter's Creative Touch 5, and this is the beginnings version of the software. It is a little simpler, it's a little stripped down, but you can still do amazing things with it. So if we click Select and Sew, you saw at the bottom there, it was really brief, but it said Power Placement. So I'm gonna back it out, and you can see Starting Power Placement right there on the bottom. All right, what that means is this is a new system for placing blocks. If you would like to go back to the older system for placing blocks like we had in QCT4, what you're gonna do is go into the pantograph area. Okay, I'm just gonna go on ahead and set this so that way it'll stop yelling at me. There we go. So I set my safe area and now I'm going to tap on Options. And right here we have two options. Power Place and Select and Sew. If you prefer the method of placing your blocks the way they were back in QCT4, then this is what you're going to want to select and then say OK. And then go back. We're going to go back home, Select and Sew. I'm just going to grab this one just to show you. And we're going to be back on the original screen that we had in QCT4. And so we're back here, we've got our settings, everything is back to the way it was with QCT4. So I'm going to X out of here because we really do need to get used to using QCT5, the way it's designed. And it was really designed in a very cool way. So I'm going to go back to my Power Place. This is the new setting, the new way it works. I'm going to tap OK, go back to my home, go back to Select and Sew, and now I'm going to grab a block. Okay, so once you get back into this screen, you can see we've got all of our blocks. I'm going to dial down here, show you all of the different cool designs that you have that you can use. What you're going to do if you want to open one of these is you're just going to tap on it to select it and then tap Open. Okay, so now let's work together to place this 2.gpf file. This is our block number 2. I'm going to tap on it so it's surrounded with blue and click Open. And it says Starting Power Placement. Okay, so this is the new system for QCT5 for placing blocks. And how they are placed is by tapping these corners, and that is telling the block where it's going to go. Now I'm way on the bottom, so I'm going to move my machine back and then tap that corner again, and you can see it just stretched it out. It just moved it. I'm going to shimmy my machine over and tap that next corner. So instead of before in QCT4, we had all of those buttons kind of down here on the bottom. Now we're selecting those and you can see we're selecting them right on the screen and putting them together just like that. So let me budge that over a little bit. And it's going to be however you select it, you know, and I'm not really selecting a square shape on my quilt. I'm just kind of rolling it around and eyeballing it. But that's going to be the shape dependent upon these things, okay? So we've got options down here. We've got, number one, we've got our placement method, and you can tap all right here to see all the different placement methods. One point is going to be either in the center, like basically just centering the block up, or starting in one corner. So if I select that, let me push it back here, and let me tap the center. So that's basically going to say that block is centered up in that spot, and it's going to be stitched out according to the sizes that are listed right here. So 4.2 and 4.2. Now, if I wanted to change that size or make sure it's placed better in the block on the quilt, then I would want to choose a different placement method. All right, so let's go back to all. Let's talk about 2 points. What would this be good for? This would probably be better for something like one of the continuous line designs, something like that, where we want to have the start point and the end point. And see, here I'm way on the edge of my quilt, and it knows that. So it's already saying, yeah, probably not a good idea to put it there. So there we go. And then tap there. And it's also rotating it. So that 2 placement is kind of almost a rotation effect as well. And yeah, see, you can also set this down here, start point, end point, stretch, and fit. So that's not really my favorite placement method, to be completely honest. I like block and 4 points. 4 points being my favorite because that gives you each corner, and you can choose 2 different fill methods, stretch or fit. So what's the difference? Stretch, let's say your block is just ever so slightly wonky. I'm going to tap these and just move them around. And again, I'm just telling you, I'm eyeballing this completely based off of the quilt that I've got on the machine right now. So I'm just tapping these and eyeballing it. And obviously this block is just a little bit off. As you can see, it's a little bit longer than it is wide, okay? Well, stretch takes that into account, and it's going to make the design be longer to fill in that area. Now, it's going to be visually stretched, but if your piecing is ever so slightly off, that's a really nice feature because it's not going to be obvious that your piecing is off. The design is going to be filling in the space nicely. Now, let's say you didn't want that. You wanted a square inside of a rectangle. Then you're going to select Fit. And in this case, those placement points stay the same. You see they're still highlighted in green, so they are still placed. But now the design is fitted, meaning that instead of it stretching into a rectangle, it is now a square. The Fit selection with 4 points maintains the aspect ratio of the square. So if it's designed to be a square, it's gonna stay a square, and it's simply going to say, okay, we're gonna put that in the center of those 4 points and make it as big as I can, but not stretching it out to fill in the rectangle completely. So that is what that's used for. So now let's talk about these different settings that we have down here. We have flip, the ability to flip it sideways, vertically, or horizontally. Now this is a fully symmetrical design, so you're not going to really be able to see that you flipped it. We also have rotate, and you can rotate by 1 degree, 5 degrees, 15 degrees, and 45 degrees. And then you can also reset it by tapping the 0 degrees button too. You can also type in how much you want to rotate it in that little box as well. Now the margins area is, this is very similar to what we had with QCT5. So let's say I want to shrink this block, so it's going to stitch within the margins by a bit, let's say 1/2 inch, so 0.25, and that's going to shrink that down. And because I have selected fit, it's going to shrink that down, maintaining the square, and then now giving me 1/2 inch from where I selected those points. Now if I say stretch, it's going to do the same thing, only it's stretching it out again, filling it in completely, but now squeezing it in by 1/2 inch. Now, what if you didn't want the margin to be equal? If you wanted maybe more margin on the sides, less margin at the top. So in that case, you're going to unlock the little lock box, and then you're going to expand in whatever direction that you want to. So there we go. I could take that back out to 0 and then leave the other direction, the vertical direction, at 1/2 inch. Now at any given time, if you're wanting to reset these settings, just click the reset button and that will take everything back to 0. And then you can put your lock box back on and then the margins will now shrink down at the same rate. So I really like that. I usually go with shrinking my block down either by 1/2 of an inch or by 1/4 of an inch. It's something I find super useful. And now that we have more capability here, as you can see, we can really fine tune this and just have, just a little smidgen, an 1/8 of an inch from our ditches, our seam lines on our blocks. I think that's going to be really cool. It's going to give us a lot of capability and control over the designs on our quilts. All right, let's talk about a few more tools that we have in our toolbox. Toolbox is right over here. I'm going to tap on that. And we've got placements, which is this screen. So this is selected. We've got ruler and we've got marking tool. If you dial down, then you'll see we've also got set safe area. So if you wanted to reset your safe area, you can always do that by dialing all the way down and setting that up right there. So let's go over the ruler area. And I'll be honest, I have not really used this space very much, this tool very much. So let's just go ahead and set this. What we would do is we would set a start point and select that there. And then the end point, select that there. And then we're able to measure the length. So length right here is 6.176. So if you're ever curious, like, oh, is that block not quite the right size, something along those lines. If ever you're trying to move your machine around and you can't, then always you can release your carriage to be able to move that around easily. And if you wanted to go back to your start point, you could select this button that would move the needle and the machine back to that start point. So I'm going to tap that and just show it to you. It's going to link in, connect with my machine. I'm going to say OK because my needle is up, and it's going to move back to that start point where I first hit that start point button. OK, and then I can say move to end, and it's going to do the same thing. Ask me if my needle is up, and then it'll move over. So if ever you're needing to measure something, if ever you're needing to set up points, something like that, then this is going to be really helpful. Okay, so now let's go back to our toolbox and check on the marking tool. So this is super helpful for doing any kind of ditch work outside of the ditch that's going to go around your pattern. So let's say you wanted to do echo ditching and stitch a line that's 1/2 of an inch or 1/4 inch outside of the ditch. You wanted to stitch right in the ditch. Anything like that is going to be done with your marking tool. And you can also add several different sets of markings to your block. You could even possibly invent your own designs. So let me show you what that would look like. I'm going to move my machine around and I'm going to just tap add, and then up here and tap add. I'm just making a random straight line design here just by moving my machine around a little bit and tapping add. And what this is doing is this is adding points. And right there, okay? And so now I'm gonna add another one. So this would be a separate marking, and then I name it. So I'm gonna just say 2 and say enter. And then this is gonna be, I think, separate from the first. So now I'm gonna tap add, and these won't connect together unless you actually tell the machine and the software to connect them together. They will stitch separately. Tap add, add, and whoops, quilt caught up on my foot there, and add. So not all that pretty, but you can see the possibilities of being able to add lots of different lines and things to your quilts. You can also use this as marking, just simply to give you a reference point if you're placing something particularly carefully on your quilt. And you can decide if you want these to stitch or not by checking the markings box. If you don't want them to stitch out, then just leave this box unchecked. If you do want it to stitch out, then make sure that box is checked. If you want to remove any of these, then you're just going to say remove selected or remove all. You can also remove your last point and go one at a time like that, or you can say remove all like that. And a really good note here is that you want to make sure that the pattern itself is placed before you use the marking tool. So you can see all of my green dots on the pattern are green, they're not gray. Green means go. It means that that is placed on the quilt, the machine and the software know where that's going. And then you can use the marking tool to place designs and ideas and stuff around it. So make sure that your block is placed and those points are all green before you go into the marking tool and start playing with that. So now we're going to stitch this out together, and I have reset the points so that way it's actually in a cute block, this little 9 patch here. So what I did was push the machine around and eyeballed it, checking to see that my needle was exactly placed in the corners of the seam lines of this block. And I have to admit, I usually keep my ruler foot on the machine, but I've been really tempted to change to a foot with a smaller hole or just more visibility so that way I could be absolutely sure that the needle is going in the right position. But just in case, in case it's off a little bit, I have shrunk the size of the design down using the margins very slightly by 0.0625. So it's like 1/8 of an inch, so 1/16 of an inch. Not very much, but that just ensures that the block design is going to be within those seam lines. It's going to be within the block. And I am using 4 points and stretch, so that way it fills the space completely. If my block is ever so slightly wonky, if it's ever so slightly off, then that's going to take into account for that. Okay, so over here I have pattern selected, but I have unselected both ditch and markings because I only want to stitch the pattern. I don't want to stitch any extra lines. If you are wanting to stitch the ditch, stitch a straight line around the design, then select ditch. If you have added markings to your quilt in the form of echo ditching or just some extra design that you've decided to add, then you want to select markings and you want these check boxes to be filled. Okay, so now that everything is ready to go, I'm going to hang on to my top thread and I'm going to tap on quilt. And that is going to send me to another screen that is going to help me place, basically pull my bobbin and do the actual quilting process. Now there are a few things for us to go over on this screen, and the first one is our settings. So we have a lot of different things here, and this looks very similar to the settings area that we worked with QCT4. I like to stitch slow, especially when I'm working on a smaller block, and I would consider anything smaller than 6 inches is small. So slower means that you're going to have just a slower movement of the machine, therefore I think a cleaner stitch out. Tie off count, this is the number of times you're going to take a stitch at the end, and that helps to, and the beginning too, and it helps to secure your thread tails so that way they don't get sucked to the back of the quilt and make a mess. So I like to set that to 2. You have 2 choices with your tie off mode, back and forth, that means the machine will move back and forth very slightly, or micro stitch, and this is just very, very tiny stitches it's going to take at the end. I prefer micro stitch simply because that means it's not going to build up any extra thread, and it wouldn't anyway because it's only set to 2 stitches. I like a lot of stitches in my blocks and my quilt, so I set this up to 15 stitches per inch, which is the max. You can go really low though. 7 stitches per inch, those are going to be pretty big stitches, so keep that in mind. If your design is particularly curvy, you're going to want to have a higher stitches per inch because the curves will look better, particularly if they're tight, tiny curves, they're going to look better if you have more stitches making that design. You have 2 check marks here, automatic bobbin pull and pause at trim lines. I like to leave these checked just simply so I have more guidance from the tablet, from the software. You can also see your pattern statistics, the height, the width, and you can see I'm just ever so slightly, it's like 0.03, slightly taller than it is wide. But stretch, this is another reason to use that stretch setting because it takes into account for that. It also lets you know how many stitches it's going to go and how many trims. So if you're curious to know if you're going to be breaking thread in a design, make sure to open this setting so that way you can check that right there. I'm going to click OK. Now another setting that you can check out, and that is optimize. Okay, so this screen opens up and it gives you lots of things that you can play with. Basically, it's going to show you if you have trims. Trims are always going to be this bright teal blue color, and we don't have any trims within this block, but you can always check for trims by saying check for breaks and then animate stitching. And so what it would do is it would stitch it out just exactly as you see. If there's a break, it will pop up and say, do you want to remove the break? And I didn't have any of those, so that's a-okay. So this is definitely going to be a screen that we use a lot in more complex designs that have breaks where we want to either choose to connect those lines together or leave them unconnected. So I'm going to click OK, it's A-OK and ready to go. So another fun setting you might want to play with is trace. If you're ever, just a little unsure about the design, maybe not sure the placement is quite right, then you can always select trace. And what it's going to do is it's basically going to put the machine in position, and it is going to act like it's stitching the design, but it's not going to move the needle. So as you can see, it's moving, but the needle isn't going up and down. And at any point in time, you can hit the big red stop button, and then you could hit resume. So I'm gonna hit stop, and then I can do trace from the start, trace from the end. I can say resume forward or resume backwards. And this is something that can be helpful if you are ever having to repair your pattern. And that is something else that we will definitely cover in a future tutorial. Pattern repair is really important. Let's say you run out of bobbin thread halfway through it. You'll want to be able to place it and be able to get back on track. And this is going to be a really useful feature. So I'm satisfied with my design, how big it is, and what it's looking like. So I'm going to now click Pull Bobbin. What this does is it guides you through a series of prompts to bring your bobbin thread up to the surface. Now, why do you want to do this? Why is this important? It's important because if you leave the bobbin thread on the back, what can happen is as your machine starts stitching, it can pull the bobbin thread to the back and make kind of a bird's nest right here at the beginning. Even when I am stitching and not doing QCT, I will often take several stitches using the buttons on my handlebars just to take a few stitches just to lock the thread tails in place. So this is something that I always do no matter whether I'm using QCT or not. Okay, so I pulled up my bobbin thread to the surface. And now you can do more things here, obviously. You can, if you didn't grab the bobbin thread, you could move away, you could move back, you could take another single stitch. I'm ready to go. I've got both thread tails in my hand, so I'm going to click Sew. And now it's going to move the machine back after it gives me a little alert. Again, you don't want to move the machine with the needle down, so it always gives you those alerts. And now it's going to move back. It's going to take those 2 micro stitches. Just a few slow stitches there, and then it's going to get going. And again, because this is a 6-inch block, because it's on the smaller side, I really think it pays to stitch this out using the slow setting. Don't force your machine to do something fast, particularly when it's doing really highly detailed work. And while I have, often used the analogy that QCT is like turning your long arm into an embroidery machine, keep in mind there's a lot more weight behind a long arm, so you're not going to be quite as exactly precise as you can be with an embroidery machine. And as you can see, this still has gorgeous stitch quality, but it does take a little while for it to stitch out to be that nice, neat, and clean. Okay, here's what it looks like once your pattern stitches out completely. Now, if something happened to it and for some reason, maybe your bobbin thread ran out, maybe your top thread shredded, at any point you could click Pattern Repair. Now what you can do here, it's already placed, so the design shouldn't have moved and nothing should have happened to that. What you will want to do is go into the toolbox and say Release Sewing Machine. What that's going to do is give you back control over the machine so you can move it around. And then you'll want to break your thread because obviously if you've broken bobbin thread or your top thread, then you're going to want to break the other thread that isn't broken. So in this case, I am just needle up, needle down, and I'm cutting my thread tails. Okay, so that's exactly what you would do. Just use the buttons on your handlebars then to do that needle up, needle down, and then pull on that top thread, pick at it, and then that little loop is going to be your bobbin thread. You can bring that up to the surface, tie those in a knot, and bury them. But let's say that this didn't break thread right in the center and finish it off super nicely. Let's say that we actually broke thread and ran out somewhere back here. Well, here's what we would do. I'm going to say, okay, we can take back control over the machine, and then I'm going to go trace back, okay? We need to first make sure that you are locked into the pattern, click closest stitch or last stitch before proceeding. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to move the machine and try and get the needle as close to that stitch, close to that spot right there as I can, and I'm going to click closest stitch. Okay, so now it's going to lock in, and it's going to be locking in and going back to that. Okay, so now I'm going to say trace forward. It's going to trace forward a little bit, and I can make sure that I'm on the line that way. I'm going to click stop. I can click trace back, and again, it's going to move back very slowly. And then I'm also looking here at the design to make sure that it's lining up with where I am in the design on the quilt, where my needle is lining up visually over that design there. Now, fine tuning, you can nudge it forward and back and up and down, whatever you're needing to do. So this is really useful for reconnecting with the design, for finishing it off. If something's gotten off, you can repair it fairly easily with this screen. Okay, so I'm going to click back because we don't need to do a pattern repair. Now at this point, if you wanted to pull your bobbin, again, you could click pull bobbin. That would move it first away, then back, then take a stitch, then back again. So it's a little bit, I find that just a little bit clunky after you've finished a pattern, but it's no big deal. So I hit back from that screen and we are back to our placement screen, our power placement screen. You can see you've got all of those settings again, and if you wanted to, if you changed your heart and you decided you really wanted to stitch a ditch around that, well then you could come over here and you could unselect the pattern, select the ditch, and then you could go back and quilt just the ditch around that design. So lots of capabilities here. If you change your mind, you can always go back in. You've already got everything placed and ready to go, so you can always do that anytime you want. So there we go. That is how to place your block, stitch it out, and get full access to all of the features within QCT5. I hope that you enjoyed this video and are excited about quilting our beautiful variety of quilt blocks within this software. So that's it for this video, and a super special thank you to Janet George for taking the time to type up these notes and create this awesome tutorial. This is going to help you understand how to use QCT5 if you're the kind of person that needs to read it and see it and watch the video all at the same time. I'm one of those types of people, so this is going to be super, super helpful. So I really appreciate that Janet took the time to make this, and you can find all of these help files at leahday.com/QCThelp. So come and check that out. Now, if you'd like to learn more about quilt automation, this is basically putting a computer on your machine and a motor on the carriage so that way it runs on its own. Come and check it out at leahday.com/QCT. This is compatible with all Grace frames, our Qnique 15, 19, and 21-inch Longarms, and some home sewing machines too. So come and learn more at leahday.com/QCT. Until next time, let's go quilt.